Welcome back to another Dietitians Unplugged episode with Aaron and Glennis.
Hello.
Hey, this is episode 13, and today we're going to talk about a subject we haven't really touched on that much before. We want to talk about eating disorders. And Aaron, this is we're interviewing somebody that you've actually met before.
Right. We're going to interview Andrew Walen, and he's someone I met at a eating disorder conference back in May, and quickly sort of built this great both professional and personal friendship. He's a really interesting guy. He has a ton of information on eating disorders, but also the male perspective on eating disorders. And I think it's a conversation that a lot of people are going to get something out of. So without further ado, here's our interview with Andrew Walen.
Roll it.
All right. Well, welcome to our 13th episode of Dietitians Unplugged. We're here with Andrew Walen, and we are going to spend some time talking about eating disorders, about the male manifestation of eating disorders. But before we go into that, Andrew, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners? Give us a little bit background about what you do and how you came to the field.
Sure. All right. Well, what I do, I'm the founder and CEO of the Body Image Therapy Center. We are an intensive outpatient and partial hospitalization eating disorders program in Columbia, Maryland, which is just south of Baltimore, and in Washington, D.C. I'm also the current president of the National Association for Males with Eating Disorders, and author of the book Man Up to Eating Disorders. So that's kind of my immediate scope. How I got here is a completely roundabout experience. I was the child of a very well-renowned, world-renowned psychologist who opened the Baltimore Center for Cognitive Therapy and was a protege of Albert Ellis, and decided growing up in that world that I wanted nothing to do with psychology or treating people or anything like that. And so I went off to go be a musician. So I actually got my undergrad degree in music from Berklee College of Music in Boston, and then was a professional musician in Nashville for about a decade, and was married and had a kid, and my son was born with some really just horrendous, awful medical issues, and I became a stay-at-home dad, and in the process had to rethink my life and how am I going to support this child who I didn't know what was in store for us, but I knew I needed a steady income and a new direction. So finally, like an epiphany, hit me like a lightning bolt. I guess I'm supposed to be a therapist after all. And I'd spent much of my life sort of talking to people and knowing their stories and being inquisitive. And the last 2 years in the music industry, I was actually a journalist as a music critic, and interviewing all these musicians. And I loved hearing their stories and getting to know their deep stuff. I could drive in there and get it. But then, like, at the end of the interview, there was nothing left. I just got to write a story. I didn't feel like I was involved. And I knew I wanted to be involved. So going to graduate school to be a therapist seemed like, okay, this is it. It's what I'm supposed to do. And why I chose eating disorders is simply because in graduate school, I started to do much deeper investigation into my own issues. And I had been diagnosed with, depression as a late teenager, and I had been through the ringer with, all kinds of, different therapists at different points of my life who never identified that one of the core issues was this body image issue that was driving these eating disorder behaviors, starting with I came to realize in treatment, started with being a heavy kid as I had turned to food when my parents split up when I was young, and uh, became the easy target for bullies for teasing, and bullies not only from school kids but from my own parents and siblings. And they thought they were, of course, helping me by saying, let's take you to Weight Watchers at 12, and instead just continued to ingrain that you're not good enough the way you are mentality. And down the road I went to the point where I was anorexic as a senior in high school, though they wouldn't have diagnosed me that because I'd started at a very heavy weight and got down to a normal weight. But I did it by restricting to next to no calories a day and compulsively exercising. So as I've started to delve into this history of body image shame and eating disorder behavior, that then morphed into the years that I was trying to be a star in Nashville, where I had people in the music industry telling me I had to lose weight, I had to have a nose job, I had to do all these things to fit the image. And so I became, once again, compulsive about the behaviors until they flipped into binge eating, when my body just broke down on me. And how it broke down on me was I couldn't see myself as just doing exercise for any kind of joy or fun. It was all for the purpose of building muscle and losing fat so I could see the musculature. And that is the classic experience of males with eating disorders, and nobody caught it. I remember going into a therapist's office because I was deeply distressed and depressed, and I told him this experience of, I feel like when I go into a restaurant to go meet my friends for dinner and drinks, I feel like I open the door and it's like an old Western. You sort of hear the doors, the swinging doors, and go, whir, 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 and like the piano player's, and all of a sudden stops, and everybody, the drinks, crash to the ground, and everybody's looking at the stranger who's walked into town. And that's the experience I had. That was what I imagined was happening. And his response was to me, you're a real shit. And I'm a what?
And this
totally
is
shocking.
And this is your therapist.
And this is my therapist. Yeah. And he said, you're a real shit. I'm like, what are you talking about? He said, well, you're going in there and you're judging everybody else to be this incredibly judgmental group, and they're all looking at you. So it's really your problem, and you just need to get over it. And so
God,
that was that's how not to treat somebody.
Right.
So I felt, it's my fault. I'm weird. I just need to get control of my eating, and I need to lose weight. Then I won't have these issues. And so that was the ongoing experience until grad school. Thankfully, I had great opportunities to work with really renowned practitioners. One woman in particular who I always give a shout out to is Reba Sloan. And Reba was my dietitian, who I think saved my life and took all the craziness that I had about food, and first, she normalized it. She gave me, just enough information to help me get started in the sort of a health at every size. Let's just get you, not thinking about numbers and calories and specifics and all just bring it back down to core stuff that I was so unwilling to deal with at first, and she just wrote it out with me and helped guide me, and for 2 years she was by my side while I worked through these issues, and I will never forget how much that helped change my life and set me down the path that I have now, and she did it with grace and dignity and honesty, and I can't thank her enough, because that's what I feel like gave me the charge that I needed to go down and be a therapist and offer that same back to my clients. And eventually, to the point where I moved from a private practice to wanting to offer, more intensive services to clients that need it.
And so let me ask you a question, because the thing that stands out, I mean, well, there's a lot of things within that story. So thank you so much for sharing so much of that
Sure.
With us. Is this, there are a couple things. One is, you mentioned at the very beginning, you sort of noticed that you have this inquisitive mind. And I noticed that firsthand because Andrew and I got to meet about 2 months ago now in San Francisco at ICED, which is the International Conference on Eating Disorders. We spent 2 nights through dinner, maybe it must have been at least 6 hours between both, if we sum up both of them. And, you do have this inquisitive mind, and I can tell just by talking to you that that's your nature to ask people questions that get them to think. And so when that sort of lightning bolt hit for you, were you surprised, or did you just sort of realize, no, this is totally what I need to do?
I remember I'm going to give you the long version answer to that. So I remember being 16 years old and going to see the movie Dead Poets Society. Do you remember that movie?
Of course. Oh, Captain, my Captain.
All right. Oh, Captain, my Captain. Carpe Diem, seize the day. And I saw it. It was just towards the end of my sophomore year in high school. And I was so floored by the movie Carpe Diem, seize the day. I had all these, I had like 2 summer jobs lined up as a lifeguard, and it was going to be just another routine summer. And I said, I can't do that. I have to go. I had this lightning bolt of, I have to go and do something and fulfill this dream, this need, this whatever. And so I literally, I packed up a trunk, my old camp trunk, with clothes and stuff and gear, and threw my guitar in my car with my trunk. And I drove into the mountains in Pennsylvania, and got a job. Didn't tell my parents. Just I ran away from home at 16, and just rolled out for a summer and spent 10 weeks out at a camp on a lake. Just I needed a change of scenery, and I said, I'll work for you guys, room and board free. Go do it. Carpe diem, seize the day, And it was like, yeah. And that mentality is sort of been something that I think I've always had to some degree. I remember when I was finishing school in Boston at Berkeley, and I had the same thing. I went down to Nashville like 2 months after I graduated, and just kind of checking out the town and seeing it. And I had an apartment. I had, stuff. I had a job. And I didn't take the flight back home. I just called my roommate and said, can you sell all my stuff and send me whatever you get for it?
Wow.
And I just found an apartment and just stayed, and that's sort of been this, if you jump all in and you have the adventure. And, so when I had this next epiphany, at 30 years old, okay, this is the next adventure. And so there was no hesitancy.
Yeah.
I immediately just started researching, all right, what am I going to do next? And that was the right time, the right gift. The gift I had really was my wife, who I've been with for 16 plus years now, was completely supportive and said, whatever is going to make you happy, let's find a way to do it.
So what's
Can't get better than that.
So what's interesting is we have very parallel stories on that level, because at 30 I went back to be a dietitian, like full tilt also, just quit jobs and just said, I'm doing this full time. So again, supportive wife behind me to help me through that. So that's interesting. It's so similar. So my
God bless the supportive wives.
Right.
And supportive husbands.
Right.
There you go.
Of which I have a supportive partner. So.
All right.
So here's my second question is,
Yeah.
and it sort of feeds into sort of your work as president of National Association of Males with Eating Disorders, is what have you noticed as you mentioned how no one knew what was going on with you. It was just sort of undiagnosed. No one really knew what to look for. How do you see that changing now? Are things getting better? What can we do to make people more aware of this issue with men?
Great question. I don't think that there's a really great answer. Here's what my experience was. At 31, I would say, when I was really engaged in treatment, my experience of are there other guys going through this? What's out there? And I started looking for literature. And I could only find one book called Making Weight, which is still, I think, the original classic book on males with eating disorders, and the place where most people should probably start to understand it. But that was all that was out there. And there literally was nothing else. And it didn't speak to me, because my experience at that time was I had moved from all these various forms of an eating disorder to binge eating disorder. And the majority of what was out there, nobody talked about binge eating disorder. It wasn't even a term when I started treatment. They called it, compulsive overeating, right, or, what. It wasn't. There's nothing official about it, and so I still struggled with, the diagnosis. And so, what has happened since then is there's been an ongoing effort, I think, by researchers and individuals who are just starting to come out of the woodwork a little bit, and writing about their own personal experience. And I think the more we develop this normalization and slowly see more and more men come out and say, I have this disorder, no different than, the women who were coming out in the 70s and 80s and saying, I got anorexia, I've got bulimia, and what have you, and became more and more normalized. And so the industry popped up because in all honesty, I think money drives information. And so they saw, all right, let's increase the awareness of this. Maybe we can treat them and make money off of that. I think that's literally how it went. And that's a very sad state of things, but I think it's the reality of things. We are seeing that there are still no treatment centers, that when I was getting help, that accepted males. There might have been certainly none that would have treated binge eating disorder. Rogers Memorial Hospital was the only inpatient program that had just a program for men, period, up until very, very recently. I still, when I ask around, there's still no residential programs that just treat males. They say there's a lot more programs that are now opening up beds for co-ed programs. But again, men tend to do better with men, is what the research shows. Not that they can't get better in co-ed groups, just like women can absolutely get better in co-ed groups. But there's a connection that happens for many just within their own gender that feels safer and normalizes the experience and frees them up to be able to speak about deeper truths, traumas, and hopes and dreams, in all honesty. So, here's what I'm worried about is we're still just, punching at this glass ceiling, trying to break through and have more people come out and talk about the experience. But it's still seen as, if you're a man and you have an eating disorder, it's seen as a female disease, and it's seen as a gay man's disease.
Yeah.
Even though statistically speaking, that shouldn't matter regardless. You have a disease, you have a disease. You get it treated. But the reality is men make up at least 25% of those with anorexia and bulimia. And some studies suggest probably more like 33% or more. And binge eating disorder, males make up about 40% or more, and that's probably also underreported. And we're now having a much better understanding of how males differ in terms of eating disorders. That we will talk more about this later, but muscle dysmorphia is the much more common experience rather than anorexia or bulimia, but muscle dysmorphia is really the stronger male experience of eating disorders.
So,
and
Andrew,
heterosexual, yeah.
I had just seen that term on your website, and I hadn't heard it before. But as soon as I read it, I sort of had a picture of what, and I think I've known people that have probably had that. Could you talk a little bit more about what muscle dysmorphia is? Just because that's a really new term for me.
Yeah, so we used to call it the Adonis complex or reverse anorexia, but it's basically that males are, unlike females, tend to be much more focused on the definition and the nuance of their musculature, particularly from the waist up. So, the idea is not that they're trying to lose weight, but they are doing whatever they can to increase muscle definition. And so by reducing calories, they think, I'm going to be cutting fat, not understanding, that they're also cutting muscle. But the behaviors become compulsive. I have to hit the gym every day, all the time. For me, my experience was very much with muscle dysmorphia in my 20s. I had to get rid of the fat, not to get a weight per se, but I needed to lose the fat on my body so I could see the muscles underneath. I remembered Usher talking, the artist Usher talking about his abs and that he didn't have a six-pack, he had an eight-pack. There was a muscle in the lower musculature that he was able to define. Oh, I have to get that. So I became a compulsive runner, and I ran even though I was starting to develop, significant pains in my left hip, to the point where I barely could walk, but I was still going to go out and I was going to run.
Wow.
And to the point where I finally went to a doctor and he said, they did an MRI and they showed me that I was basically bone on bone in my left hip. So he said, you keep this up and you're going to need a hip replacement before you're 30. And so that scared me enough to switch gears. And I thought, well, if I can't lose the fat, then I better make the muscles bigger. So I became a compulsive lifter. And again, all driven by this crazy need for the musculature. And I began to compulsively lift weights until I tore both rotator cuffs and labrums in both shoulders, and had to have them both completely surgically repaired. And the craziness of all of this.
And this is in your 20s, correct?
And this is in my 20s, absolutely.
So,
and when I couldn't do any of that, then the eating disorder for me morphed into binge eating because I was just so depressed. I had nothing left. But go ahead.
So my question for you is, what was not your therapist, but like the people around you, what was their response to this level of exercise in your life?
Well, this is what's interesting is that almost every guy that I knew was doing the exact same thing.
Right.
And I, not to jump too far ahead, but almost every male that I've worked with who is not strictly just a binge eating disorder case, but someone who has dabbled in bulimic behaviors and anorexic behaviors and the exercise behaviors, all report that from the earliest adolescent age, going and being in the gym with their friends and running or lifting weights multiple times a day is the norm for them and their buddies. And that cutting out fats or cutting out carbs or doing something unhealthy with their diet is a big part of it. And every male roommate that I had in my 20s did the same thing. And they're pounding, muscle growth, supplements and I knew guys who were using steroids, and steroid abuse has gone up exponentially over the years. Where it's I'm going to try and find the actual statistic here. This may be a good time for, and stay tuned for in the future. We're going to have this really great topic.
We'll do it. We could always do like a little teaser trailer,
Right.
We'll find out.
Exactly.
We're going to find out that Luke is really Darth Vader's son in a future episode. So stay tuned for that.
No way.
Way.
Really?
Yeah.
Let's see. I think I am gonna find this great sad statistic on the increase in steroids. I'm looking for my picture of Mark McGuire. Here it is. Up to 32%. Here, this is what we talk about is that when I talk with male clients, I usually have to screen for steroid and APED abuse. And APED stands for appearance and performance enhancing drugs. We always talked about PEDs in the past. We thought only athletes who were trying to gain an advantage in their sport use these. Now it's APEDs, appearance and performance enhancing drugs.
So is that something like I would buy at like GNC? Is that like what you're talking about?
Probably more like steroids, like anabolic steroids and what have you.
Okay.
But up to 32% of high school juniors and seniors have been using them, according to a study at Texas A&M. Recent Penn State study found 175,000 girls in college are using APEDs, a 200% increase from 7 years ago. So that's really scary stuff.
Yeah.
That's just how much, this is a serious and legitimate issue. And it's driven by that muscle dysmorphia, that belief that I have to be more muscularly defined. Not necessarily huge like you see, the power lifters, but the definition of the muscles is so emotionally important for whatever reason for that particular individual.
And Andrew, are you seeing this happening in younger and younger people? Because I've just noticed recently I work out at my local YMCA, and I've just noticed like really young kids, almost like I think they're in high school, and they're coming in and they're like trying to lift the weights. And I just think, no, you're too young for that. Go out and do something fun. And I'm just wondering how much this is affecting, like, is it getting even younger than people in their 20s now that are kind of obsessed with muscle building?
I think that we're probably, am I seeing it in my personal practice? I would say in the younger kids, I'm seeing more just the restriction behaviors than the obsessive gym behaviors, but I do see it. We've had to put many, adolescents, male and female, on restriction from going to the gym with their parents. But the parents also, particularly in these families, are very focused on the gym.
Right.
And it's a big part of their family's experience. And so the parents still going, and the kids can't go, and they nobody wants to say no. So they said, oh, okay, well, yeah, you can go, but you can only use the treadmill for half an hour. So the kid will then, instead of doing a run, does a half-hour sprint.
Sure.
Yeah. Anything to try and burn as much as they can, again, for the focus on the muscle definition.
Right. And I'm wondering if that's not getting picked up too, because we've normalized this gym behavior so much. So it's sort of like, young guys starting to go to the gym. It's like, of course you're going to do that because of course you want to work out and build your muscles. So it's not maybe that young in their lives. It's not seen as an abnormal behavior. And maybe
that's exactly right. It's exactly right. And even the middle-aged guys who have the quote-unquote dad bod, they're they go to the gym and after they've consumed, 2 Big Macs, and they're compulsively burning calories. They know the Big Macs were, X amount of calories combined. All right, I have to go and be on the treadmill till I burn that number of calories. And so they're not exercising for any kind of fun. They're doing it as a punishment for the food that they've eaten. Yeah. And that is extremely common.
So you're on the East Coast, right? We're out here in LA.
Yes.
Again, very image conscious city. I'm wondering, because what you're talking about, if I can sort of summarize, is this sort of behavior where there's this compulsion with going to the gym, compulsion with maybe some restrictive eating habits, compulsion on muscle definition, on getting the perfect body in the male sense, getting to look like Captain America or something like that.
Sure.
And so the question I have is, we're here in LA, and it seems like that's a lot of people here in LA. So how do we, especially as a clinician, how do we tease out when it becomes a disorder or when it's just someone who is doing something healthy for their body, and it's finding, they have balance with it? Like, how do we tease that out?
That's a great question, and I think it's a matter of understanding that if a person is exercising and putting anything else in their lives secondary to that exercise, or following this very rigid experience about body image and food and all these behaviors, when that becomes the predominant issue, then that's when I worry. If they're saying, 2-3 times a week, and sometimes I go on my trip, I try to, but if I do, I do, I don't. That's not the person I worry about. Even though there may be some weeks where they really enjoy exercising every day. My father is a great example of someone who I respect his exercise, because what he does is he wants to be able, as a 76-year-old, just to feel healthy, and goes on lovely bike rides for the scenery. And if it's raining out, he'll go do a spin class, but he's not going to go do 5 spin classes. He's not going to, he just wants to be healthy and feel as alive as he can at the age he is. While I've seen, other guys who are in their 30s and already in great shape, but 5:30 in the morning, they've got to be at the gym. And before they go home, they've got to hit the gym a second time, because they've got so much anxiety pent up from their day, a stressful day, that they can't go home without releasing all of that. And if they don't get to do that, they have no other outlets for their anxiety. So it's not always driven by body image. A lot of this behavior is also driven by not having other tools or vocabulary or other ways to deal with whatever their life experience is that is causing them stress. It's a fight or flight experience, and they're looking to release that basic energy.
So that's really interesting. You said that about the sort of relieving the stress or relieving the anxiety, which is, sort of how I treated dieting in my life early on. Mm. And I also just noticed, I think the way a lot of people get around the obsessive, looking like they are obsessive with exercises, they make it their job. So, somebody maybe becomes a personal trainer, and then they say, well, it's my job to work out all the time and to look like this. So that, I think that presents another complication of like, well, this is my job and I need to do this. But obviously the person is still sort of, very disordered with their habits. Do you sort of, how do you work with people like that?
Very carefully. Winning trust. I've seen a number of folks who are exactly as you described. They go into the profession because it's a way for them to um, validate their obsession with exercise or healthy living. Um, but how do you convince someone that it's dysfunctional when it actually meets their lives? Um, if family and friends are insisting that they get help, and they eventually do call us, those typically are the toughest clients, and it's that's just a real hardship. But what I sometimes will do is I'll use well-validated assessment scales, um, things that I think most clinicians should know about. Because if you were to say have someone, a male, take an assessment for eating disorders or disordered body image behavior experiences, thoughts, and emotions, they're all normed for women in the past, and they don't use language that males would typically use. So some examples of good assessment scales would be the eating disorders assessment for men. Another is drive for masculinity scale. Another is male body image concerns scale, the male body checking questionnaire, body change inventory, and obligatory exercise questionnaire. And these are all validated for the male experience.
So I think it's interesting that there's all these validated tools that that we can use. So
and yet nobody uses.
Right. Right.
I've gone to every national organization that treats eating disorders and says they work with males, and I say, what tool do you use to assess males? And they never, I mean never, use these scales.
Right.
And this is what pisses me off more than anything else, is you say you treat men, but you don't bother to investigate how to appropriately treat men.
Interesting.
We are not the same.
Yeah.
We are not the same.
So here's my follow-up question with that is, you're working with a client and you use these assessment tools and you talk to them about what the assessment tool has given you, right? And you talk about treatment and, you sort of engage in this discussion like, you might have an eating disorder, you might have muscle dysmorphia, you might have these things. How do people relate with the stigma associated with that of being a man and then having an eating disorder?
Relating to it is, I think, the biggest problem we have right now. The dropout rate for males in treatment is very high because they will be very compliant, much more so than females on a statistical level, to get out of treatment quickly. So they will do, exactly what they have to do behaviorally without touching on the emotional stuff. And so what happens is they get in, they get out, and they move on and think that they're done. And what happens is typically they have a higher failure rate for a couple of reasons that's theorized. One is that they don't get treatment until they are much sicker, because people don't, A, look for males with eating disorders, and B, men are in much greater denial and only go when they absolutely have to, which means that the eating disorder has lasted longer and is more neurologically ingrained. And then on the flip side, there's much more shame and stigma about, if I relapse, so, I'm a horrible person, I can't do this. We see a higher rate of death in males with anorexia than females after treatment failure, and not because of suicide, but because of medical complications from their disorder.
Interesting. So going back to when we met in, I believe it was May, one of our conversations that I still think about today is, we were sort of sharing our own personal stories. And, on this podcast, I've shared a lot about my own personal story with chronic dieting and my own struggles with body image and things like that. And the thing that I still think about is at one point, Andrew, you said, Aaron, what makes you because I would always say I didn't have an eating disorder, but I was on my way to getting one. And you said to me, Aaron, what makes you think that you didn't have an eating disorder? And that hit me hard. And I really did have to think about it. And, and I think what troubled me, or not troubled me, but what was the hardest part of that was the stigma part. Like, oh my goodness, what if I did have an eating disorder? Like then maybe I do. It rippled into this, like, oh my goodness, I might be one of these people, or I might have this. And that,
I gotta say, I love that I shook your world.
No,
sorry.
So am I. I'm incredibly thankful that you shook my world, because it got me to think more.
And what I remember I said was, if you had a woman in your office who had said all of the same things that you just described to me, would you think that she had an eating disorder or not?
Right.
And I remember that very same comment. And you looked at me sort of like, huh? And that. So I'm curious. So how did that affect you now? How do you perceive it?
I think I'm still coming to terms with it, that I had some level of an eating disorder, and that for me to accept that it wasn't just chronic dieting. I wasn't just a good dieter. I was obsessed. It was taking over my life, and it was an unhealthy balance. It's difficult, but it's also incredibly understandable. And I'm learning to really accept that I had an eating disorder, and that it's, even to say it out loud, right? It still takes some, there's some feelings involved with that, but
Sure.
But most importantly, I think what I take from the conversation is not only that it got me to think, but that as men, sometimes we don't have the tools to get in touch with difficult feelings. And, I don't know many other people in my life who would have said to me, Aaron, dude, you had an eating disorder. Like, you probably, like, what makes you think you didn't? And so, I think as men, what we need is better tools to be able to express our emotions and be able to sit with our emotions, instead of, like you said, running off to the gym and lifting weights, or, going for a bottle of beer, or reacting with anger. Because I think maybe those are our defaults. Yeah. And I think the secondary sort of thankfulness of that is that after just meeting someone, I have this friend that I can like share feelings with. So it was really profound, and I continue to think about it. So thank you.
You're very, very welcome. I'm honored that you share that with me, and obviously with your listeners. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah. So again, so as you work with men, right? How do you empower them with these tools to feel their emotions?
It's a matter of, I keep hammering home, it's just a couple of guys. We're just talking, and we're, and I don't overemphasize at the beginning, trying to get them to talk about emotions. I'm just trying to get them to talk. And if you can share your thoughts with me, and not yet be using feeling words, I mean, it's still a stepwise motion forward. Can you just share what happened? And then I can then work to teach them by modeling how, if I were in their shoes, boy, that's happening to me, God, I feel pissed off. How about, and start to get them to work with me in a dialogue, what might be happening with them. And I found that the men who stick it out with me, I've had guys who barely want to shake my hand, when they first come in the door, and they're reaching out for hugs. Sort of like the movie Good Will Hunting, where he hugs his therapist at the end, and he's crying in his therapist's arms, and it's so cathartic. And these moments actually happen; they really happen. And guys absolutely have these intense feelings, and they've been taught for so long, man up, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, tough it out. If you can walk off the football field, don't. All of this bravado and machismo and whatever else. But that's an American experience. It's not necessarily a male experience, because if we go into Latin American culture, feelings are strong and powerful, and ability to share your love and affection for other men is normal. Same in Middle Eastern cultures, and but then it's different in say Western European cultures or what have you. And this is not a male thing. This is a just our own mishigas that we have to get through. And if we can break down that barrier by modeling for each other and normalizing it and creating our own culture of intimacy, the way there's a great book that just came out called Tribe on homecoming but it's written by the guy who wrote the book The Perfect Storm. But he talks about the experience of our soldiers coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and how powerful their connection is. Those who have served overseas have much less PTSD, because with their brothers in the foxhole or in the tank or out on the front lines, they are bonded and they share everything. Emotions are normalized, and you feel connected. It's that tribe mentality that is missing in our culture, where we are all just staring at our phones, or we're all out on our own, and you can be alone in a crowded room kind of mentality. And my hope is that we continue to bust down that barrier, just one person at a time, coming forward and sharing their story and normalizing it. Normalize it is the key first step.
Yeah.
We have feelings, share them, and then just sit there and go, all right, what do you got for me after that?
Right.
So, Andrew, the one thing I started thinking about is I'm assuming there's sort of been this uptick in eating disorders for men over, it has to be over the last at least 10 or 20 years, I'm guessing. Or at least in diagnosing them. But what I'm thinking of is that we used to just think of this as a disease that affected women. And I'm wondering how much, I guess I'm thinking of sort of intersectionality at this point, where, I mean, how much of this is that women have sort of been held to a standard of looking a certain way. Our value has sort of been about what we look like. And I often think about that hasn't necessarily gotten better for us, and instead it's bled over into the male world now, where it's sort of instead of women being judged less for our appearance, it's now men are also being judged for their external appearance. And I'm just thinking about like watching an old James Bond movie with Sean Connery, and he takes his shirt off and he's got like kind of a total regular male body that's not worked out, and that was sort of the standard for back 40 years ago or 50 years ago. But now you see a movie, if men have to take their shirts off in it, and they've had to spend all this time working out. And so I guess I mean, how much work sort of do you do on both sides of that fence for men and women, or how do you sort of navigate that problem is getting worse for men instead of better for women?
What's interesting is I think what we're seeing is the beginning of a sea change in women, where we have much more body positive outlets for women, for whether it's it's fat acceptance or fashion, the curvy fashionista or what have you. And there's this, the mayor in London being able to take down, all inappropriate ads on buses that depict inappropriate expectations for women. So I think we're seeing the beginning of a sea change there. But certainly not. It's scratching the surface. For men, I think we're probably 20 years behind. In all honesty, we are just now understanding that men are struggling with their body image, and that we are constantly bombarded with products. We didn't see weight loss being advertised to men until 5 years ago, where like half the ESPN desk crew all went on Weight Watchers or Nutrisystem altogether, and they all lost X amount of weight, and they all put it back on, except for Dan Marino, who is still hawking the product. And that's as long as there's money to be made, and they see that men are becoming more and more obsessed with the thin ideal or the hypermuscular ideal. We just haven't reached that crest yet, and it's really sad. And I don't know that there's enough. The voices aren't loud enough to normalize it yet. There was a post put out by the Militant Baker, I believe, of the top 5 men in the positive body image movement, which is how Aaron and I got to know each other. We were both on that list. And, but have the 5 of us all been able to reach each other and collaborate and build from that initial, experience? It's little bits here and there. But we've got a long road ahead of us. And I hope that all of us are in it for, the decades to come, until the next generation comes along and starts to initiate that sea change that I hope we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there needs to be more voices, and right now it's a small few of us, but hopefully in time more people will lend to it. I think my notion is that it's for some men it's hard to be vocal about it, that this is my body and it's not a superhero, it's not Wolverine, it's not Captain America, it's not a comic book body, but it's still my body, and it still allows me to do all the things that I want to do in my life, and it doesn't hold me back, and it's not an apology. This is just who I am.
Right.
And I'm
your
wondering,
body is your home, not your billboard.
yeah.
Right.
And I'm wondering how much of it being difficult for men to talk about their bodies is because the body and what it looks like has been sort of the unfortunate realm of women, and to talk about being okay with your body is sort of like, oh, that's a girl thing, and
I used to go into high schools and middle schools and try to give these basic body image talks. And invariably, the boys are all sort of giggling and laughing and high-fiving each other or fist-bumping each other like, yeah, that's this girl or that's that girl. And I would call them out and say, well, you guys don't think, guys have issues with their bodies? He said, nah, I'm ripped, dude. I just work out. And that's as far as it'll go.
Right, and the fact that
the extent of the thinking,
and the fact that they are saying, "Well, I'm ripped," it's like, well, you are thinking about your body. So it's sort of like this secret,
right.
Yeah, it's this secret thing where it's like we're not allowed to admit that we're talking about our body. You're thinking about our bodies, and yet we're all thinking about our bodies and worrying about being buff someday.
It's the comparison issue. It's always the comparison issue, and instead of living in the body that you have, I'm was 100% guilty of that, because my perception of who I was supposed to be growing up, was this sort of hairless body with flowing, with lush long hair, and strong jawline and lots of big bulging muscles. And I had spent 20 years fretting about that and trying to force my body into that. And I had the most wonderful experience. As I said, I am a from Russian Jewish descent, classic Eastern United States, New York, moved to Baltimore, Jewish, and so I hadn't lived in Baltimore. I'd been in Boston and Nashville for several, gosh, 18 years or whatever it was, and moved home with my wife and my son, and we joined our very first summer back in the Baltimore area, joined the Jewish Community Center for the swimming pool. And I'm going there, and I set up my chair and I plunked down, and I'm looking around at all of these bodies, all of these men, and look, that guy's bald like I'm bald. That guy, he's got hair on his back just like I do. Look, he's got the same skinny arms and legs just like I do. And then started to realize I am among my people. This is my gene pool right here. I was destined to look this way, and it was this wonderful laughter moment. Because I had forgotten not being among this large set of Russian Jews that live in Baltimore. That this is what you're gonna be. This is you're destined for this. You can't force your body to be what it doesn't want to be, not without great consequence.
And I think that is such a great point, right, for our listeners to hear, right, is that our bodies are to be what they're meant to be, and we can't change them unless it's drastic and most likely unhealthy for us.
Well, and it becomes the creation of our lives, the project
Right.
of our lives.
Yeah.
At the expense of all other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Andrew, I think you've given us and our listeners so much to think about, and I really appreciate your perspective on this. And I'm so fortunate for Jess Baker, the Militant Baker, to put us in social media contact with each other. And I'm glad that we've been able to meet and talk. And I think this has just been super enlightening for me and I'm sure for our listeners.
Well, I really appreciate the time, and for those who want to learn more about males with eating disorders, please go to the National Association for Males with Eating Disorders website, which is namedinc.org, and it's a good spot to see the latest research articles, and you can follow us on social media, and we have a number of men who are writing their stories and sharing their experience and doing that very hard work of creating a tribe of people who are coming out and saying, this does not make you weird. This is just a phenomenon that is real and hard, and you can recover from it.
Absolutely. And also I'll give you, so Andrew's Facebook page for his company, Body Image Therapy Center, is one that you totally want to follow on Facebook also, because he posts all these videos, does these live chats that are really great. And he just sort of turns on the camera, shares some thoughts about a lot of different eating disorder thoughts and things like that. So you definitely want to follow Andrew there. So we'll put links to all those in our comments so that people can connect with you there.
Fantastic. Thank you. You guys have been wonderful to speak with, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It's been really great.
All right. Thanks, Andrew.
You bet.